When I first moved into my new apartment in the city, I was excited about the change. The hustle and bustle of urban life was a refreshing contrast to the quiet suburbs I had grown up in. The building itself was modern, with friendly neighbors and a sense of community that made me feel at home almost instantly. One of the first people I met was an elderly woman named Mrs. Collins. She lived in the apartment directly below mine and often spent her evenings on the front steps, chatting with other residents. She was kind and welcoming, always ready with a smile and a piece of advice about living in the city. But there was one neighbor she warned me about right from the start, Mr. Harper. He lived at the end of the hallway on my floor, in an apartment that seemed perpetually shrouded in darkness. Mrs. Collins told me he was a recluse, rarely seen outside his apartment, and when he was, he never spoke to anyone. At first, I didn't think much of it. Every building had its odd residents, and I figured Mr. Harper was just one of those solitary types who preferred his own company. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice things that made me uneasy. Late at night, I would often hear strange noises coming from his apartment. The sounds were faint but distinct, scratching, shuffling, and sometimes even low whispers. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, amplified by the unfamiliarity of my new surroundings. One evening, as I was returning from work, I passed by Mr. Harper's door and noticed it was slightly ajar. A dim, flickering light spilled out into the hallway. My curiosity got the better of me, and I peered inside. The apartment was dark and cluttered, filled with strange, shadowy shapes that I couldn't quite make out. Just as I was about to turn away, the door creaked open further, and Mr. Harper appeared. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes. I stammered an apology and hurried back to my apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. From that night on, I became increasingly aware of Mr. Harper's presence. I would see him in the hallway, standing silently in the shadows, watching me with those unsettling eyes. He never spoke, but his gaze was enough to send chills down my spine. One weekend, I invited some friends over for a small gathering. We were laughing and having a good time, enjoying some drinks and music, when there was a sudden knock on the door. I opened it to find Mr. Harper standing there, his face twisted in anger. "Keep it down," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "Some of us are trying to sleep." I apologized and promised to keep the noise down, but the encounter left me shaken. My friends noticed my discomfort and asked about it, but I brushed it off, not wanting to ruin the evening. However, the party ended earlier than planned, and my friends left, concerned about my strange neighbor. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows in my room seemed to move and shift, and every creak of the building made me jump. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. A few days later, I bumped into Mrs. Collins again. I confided in her about my encounters with Mr. Harper, hoping she might have some advice. Her expression grew serious, and she lowered her voice. "There's something not right about that man," she said. "I've lived here for years, and he's always been strange. Keeps to himself, never speaks to anyone. And those noises, I've heard them too." Her words did little to ease my anxiety. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the scratching noises again, louder this time. It sounded like something was trying to claw its way through the walls. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got to Mr. Harper's apartment, the louder the noises became. I reached his door, which was once again slightly ajar. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The apartment was even darker and more cluttered than I had imagined. Strange symbols were scrawled on the walls, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. I shone my flashlight around, trying to make sense of the chaos. In the corner of the room, I saw a figure huddled on the floor. It was Mr. Harper, his back turned to me, scratching at the floorboards. As I approached, he suddenly stopped and turned to face me, his eyes wild and frantic. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "It's coming for me. It's coming for all of us." Before I could react, the room was plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me in total blackness. I could hear Mr. Harper's panicked breathing, and then a low growl that sent shivers down my spine. I fumbled for the door, desperate to escape. As I stumbled out into the hallway, I heard Mr. Harper's screams echoing behind me, followed by a deafening silence. I didn't stop running until I was back in my apartment, the door locked securely behind me. I called the police, but when they arrived, Mr. Harper's apartment was empty. There was no sign of him, and the strange symbols on the walls had vanished. The officers assured me they would investigate, but I could tell they didn't believe me. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I kept my curtains drawn and my doors locked, afraid to leave my apartment. The noises continued, though now they seemed to come from everywhere. The walls, the ceiling, even beneath the floorboards. One night, I awoke to find my bedroom door open. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. My heart raced as I crept through the apartment, checking every room. In the living room, I found a note, scrawled in a shaky hand. "It's here." I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my things and moved out, leaving the apartment and its horrors behind. I never found out what happened to Mr. Harper, and the noises eventually stopped once I was gone. But the memory of those nights haunts me still. Every unexplained noise brings me back to that dark apartment and the sinister presence that lurked within. I can only hope that whatever it was, it stayed behind when I left, and I pray that no one else has to experience the terror that I did, living next to a mysterious loner with a darkness that defied explanation. When I first moved to Elmwood Street, it seemed like a dream come true. A quiet, picturesque neighborhood with well-manicured lawns and friendly neighbors, offering a sense of tranquility. Little did I know that my peace would be shattered by the sinister presence of my next-door neighbor. From the very beginning, Mr. Harris struck me as peculiar. He was an elderly man with a hunched back and a piercing gaze that seemed to follow me wherever I went. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were clipped and devoid of warmth. At first, I chalked it up to his old age and possible loneliness, but as the days went by, I began to notice things that made my skin crawl. Every night, without fail, I would hear strange noises coming from his house. At first, it was just the occasional thud or creak, but soon it escalated to more unsettling sounds, whispers, shuffling footsteps, and even what sounded like distant crying. The worst part was that these noises always seemed to occur around midnight when the rest of the neighborhood was asleep. One evening, after another bout of sleeplessness, I decided to confront Mr. Harris. I knocked on his door, my heart pounding in my chest. It took him an unusually long time to answer, and when he did, his eyes were wild and his clothes were disheveled. "Yes," he asked, his voice grating. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Harris, but I've been hearing some strange noises coming from your house at night. Is everything all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He stared at me for a moment before his lips curled into a sinister smile. "Just the house settling," he said cryptically before closing the door in my face. That night, the noises were louder than ever. I lay in bed, clutching my blanket, every nerve in my body on edge. Suddenly, I heard a faint tapping on my window. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned my head. There, standing in the darkness, was Mr. Harris, his eyes glowing with an eerie light. He pressed his face against the glass, and I could see his lips moving, though I couldn't hear what he was saying. I bolted out of bed and ran to the living room, grabbing my phone to call the police. When they arrived, Mr. Harris was nowhere to be found. The officers searched his house but found nothing out of the ordinary. They assured me that he was probably just a harmless old man, but I knew better. There was something deeply wrong with him. The following days were a blur of fear and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started to notice Mr. Harris lurking in the shadows, his eyes always fixed on me. It felt like he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, I heard a loud crash coming from my basement. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made my way down the stairs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. Mr. Harris was standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by broken jars and old newspapers. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with madness. "Get out!" I screamed, backing away. He lunged at me, but I managed to dodge and run back upstairs, slamming the door behind me. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, Mr. Harris had vanished. They searched his house once more and discovered a hidden room filled with disturbing items, photographs of me taken without my knowledge, strange symbols drawn on the walls, and even a makeshift altar. The police took Mr. Harris into custody, but the damage was already done. I couldn't shake the feeling of violation and terror that he had inflicted upon me. I moved out of Elmwood Street shortly after, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. To this day, I still wonder what drove Mr. Harris to become so obsessed with me. Was it madness, or was there something more sinister at play? The lack of answers only adds to the lingering fear, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying horrors are the ones that lurk right next door. Living in an urban apartment complex has its perks: the convenience, the sense of community, and the security. At least that's what I thought until I encountered what I called the Night Stalker. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday evening, after I had finished my late shift at the local diner. As I walked down the dimly lit hallway towards my apartment, I felt a strange chill in the air. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the building's faulty heating system. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of my vanilla-scented candles welcoming me home. I locked the door behind me, bolting it for good measure. Living alone, I always took extra precautions. After a quick shower, I settled into my routine, reheating leftovers, catching up on a few TV shows, and checking my social media. As the hours passed, I began to feel an unsettling sense of being watched. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside, but there was nothing, just the dark, quiet street below. Trying to shake off the unease, I turned off the TV and headed to bed. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a faint tapping sound. My heart skipped a beat. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I got out of bed and cautiously approached the door. I pressed my ear against it, and the tapping stopped. Holding my breath, I peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I waited for a few moments before reluctantly heading back to bed. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly lady who had lived in the complex for decades. She shook her head and told me it was probably just the building settling. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of fear, that made me question her explanation. The following nights, the tapping returned. Sometimes it was accompanied by a soft whispering, other times by a faint scratching sound. My sleep became restless, filled with nightmares of shadowy figures lurking in the corners of my apartment. I started to dread the evenings, the moment when the sun dipped below the horizon and the noises began. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I decided to confront whatever was causing the disturbances. I armed myself with a baseball bat and waited by the door. The tapping started, louder than ever. I swung the door open, ready to face my tormentor, but the hallway was empty. Frustrated and exhausted, I slumped against the doorframe. As I stood there, I noticed something odd. Faint footprints leading from my door to the stairwell. My heart raced as I followed the trail. The prints were wet, as if someone had been walking in the rain, but it hadn't rained in days. The footprints led me to the basement. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I had to know what was going on. I descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was a maze of storage units and old machinery, the perfect place for someone to hide. I followed the footprints to the back of the basement, where they disappeared into the shadows. I shone my flashlight around, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Suddenly, the light flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands trembling, and managed to get it working again. The beam of light landed on a figure standing a few feet away. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. He stared at me with a malevolent grin, and I realized with a jolt of terror that he was the Night Stalker. He took a step towards me, and I swung the bat, but he was faster. He grabbed my wrist and twisted it, forcing me to drop the bat. "You shouldn't have come down here," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. I kicked him in the shin and broke free, running towards the stairs. He followed, his footsteps echoing behind me. I burst through the basement door and slammed it shut, locking it from the outside. My hands shook as I called the police, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The police arrived within minutes, but when they searched the basement, they found no sign of the man. The footprints had disappeared, and there was no evidence that anyone had been there. They assured me that they would increase patrols in the area, but their words did little to calm my nerves. For weeks, I lived in fear, jumping at every sound and constantly looking over my shoulder. The tapping stopped, but the sense of dread lingered. I installed additional locks on my door and even set up a security camera in the hallway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the Night Stalker was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to return. One night, as I reviewed the footage from the security camera, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. There in the grainy video was the Night Stalker, standing outside my door, his eyes fixed on the camera. He smiled and raised a finger to his lips, as if to say, "This isn't over." I moved out of the apartment complex the next day, leaving behind everything I couldn't carry. I never told my neighbors where I was going, and I changed my phone number to ensure that I couldn't be tracked. But even now, in my new home, I can't escape the feeling that the Night Stalker is still out there, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike again. The fear lingers, a constant reminder that sometimes the most terrifying horrors are the ones that live next door. I moved into my suburban neighborhood 3 years ago, thinking it would be the perfect place to settle down. The streets were quiet, the houses were well maintained, and the community was friendly. It was everything I had hoped for and more. Little did I know that my seemingly perfect life would soon take a dark turn. My first encounter with the obsessed neighbor happened on a sunny Saturday afternoon. I was out in the yard, mowing the lawn, when I noticed a man standing at the edge of my property watching me. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face and sunken eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I gave him a polite nod and continued with my work, hoping he would take the hint and leave. Feeling helpless, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started documenting everything, every encounter, every note, every suspicious incident. I even set up additional cameras inside the house to catch any intrusions. One night, as I was reviewing the footage from the living room camera, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the corner of the frame, was my obsessed neighbor, standing in my living room, staring at me as I slept on the couch. He stood there for what felt like hours before slipping back out the way he had come. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How had he gotten inside? I rushed to check all the doors and windows, but everything was locked. It was as if he had simply materialized inside my house. I took the footage to the police, hoping this would be the evidence they needed. They promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood and keep a closer eye on my neighbor, but I could tell they were skeptical. They suggested I stay with a friend or family member for a while, just to be safe. I packed a bag and went to stay with Sarah. I couldn't bear the thought of being alone in that house any longer. While I was away, the police conducted a thorough search of my property, but found no signs of forced entry or anything else out of the ordinary. Feeling defeated, I returned home, hoping that my absence had deterred my neighbor from his sinister behavior. For a few weeks, things seemed to be normal again. But then one night, I heard the familiar tapping on my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew it was him. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands trembling. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I crept to the window and peered through the curtains, expecting to see my neighbor standing outside. But there was no one there. The tapping continued, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was coming from inside the house. I followed the sound to the living room door, which stood slightly ajar. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The living room was dark. I shone my flashlight around, trying to find the source of the noise. In the corner, I saw a figure crouched in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was my neighbor, his eyes wide and manic. I turned to run, but he lunged at me, grabbing my ankle and pulling me to the ground. I kicked and screamed, trying to break free. Just as I thought I was done for, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police burst into the living room, pulling my neighbor off of me and handcuffing him. As they led him away, he glared at me with a look of pure hatred. "I'll be back," he hissed. The police assured me that he would be locked away for a long time, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. My once peaceful home was now tainted with fear and paranoia. Even with my neighbor behind bars, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to return. In the weeks that followed, I moved out of the neighborhood, unable to live with the constant fear and anxiety. I started a new life in a new town, but the scars of that experience stayed with me. I was always looking over my shoulder, always on edge, always haunted by the memory of my obsessed neighbor. And every now and then, when the night is quiet and the wind is still, I can still hear the faint tapping on my window. If these stories made your skin crawl, remember to hit that like button and share the chills with your friends. Subscribe for more terrifying tales, and tap the notification bell so you never miss a moment of horror. Stay safe and keep watching for more spine-tingling stories. See you in the next nightmare.